Comrades, as you know, this meeting tonight is going to deal with the powers of government. Comrade Baltrop is dealing with this, but as chairman, I'm giving a very short introduction just to remind you or to tell you of some of the things the Socialist Party of Great Britain stands for, and with particular reference to the fact that it is this year 70 years since the SPGB was formed. Now, I can imagine when I make that statement, the critics will be leaping in, metaphorically speaking, and saying, yes, you've been at it 70 years, what have you got to show for it? It's a very reasonable sort of question, and on the face of it, we might have to say, well, you know, there really isn't very much to show for it. The Socialist Party came into existence to get socialism, and there is no socialism in this country, and there is no socialism in America, Canada, Australia and Austria, New Zealand, where we have companion parties. In fact, there isn't any socialism anywhere. So what, in fact, have we got to show for this? And I just make the point clear, of course, that nationalization is not socialism. It is state capitalism. And the great state capitalist powers, Russia and China and the others, have nothing to do with socialism. Now, for the moment, let me make this point, that it is no mean effort that we have survived at all. We can say that we have kept alive the idea of socialism, and as I say, that required quite a lot of effort. We have been opposed by a whole lot of big, powerful, well-financed organizations, we with our limited resources, trying to get the idea of socialism over to the working class, and these organizations, in their different ways, trying to smother the idea of socialism. Not only the capitalist class, who of course have a vested interest in preventing socialism, but a number of other organizations who in their way have done almost as much to prevent the spread of the socialist ideas as the capitalist class themselves. They were the people who argued, right from the very beginning, that socialism isn't necessary because you can go on gradually improving and humanizing capitalism so that in the end you get what you want without ever having abolished capitalism. Or you have got the other people who have claimed that they knew quicker roads to get to socialism than the one laid down by the Socialist Party of Great Britain. And not forgetting those who have done infinite harm by confusing the issue. And if I may put it very, very simply, what they have done, they haven't achieved socialism, but they have given the name socialism to state capitalism and to nationalization, thus confusing the minds of the workers and making the work of the Socialist Party all the more difficult. Now, the SPGB, when it was formed, was a distinctive organization. That is to say, it was a separate organization. It had no connection with other organizations in this country claiming to be socialist. It was apart from them and opposed to them, both organizationally and in principle, and it still is today. It still does so on the same principles as those it adopted in 1904. In setting itself up, or when the early members set the SPGB up, they knew all about all sorts of erroneous ideas that were floating around. It is one of the illusions of modern so-called left-wing organizations. They keep on discovering what they think is new. There is nothing new. None of the ideas they put forward are new. They were known 50, 80 years ago to the people who formed the Socialist Party of Great Britain. So the SPGB, when it was formed, was consciously rejecting a number of fallacious ideas. It rejected the idea that nationalization could do anything for the working class. It rejected the idea of leadership. And don't be under any misunderstanding about this. The SPGB's attitude is that leadership itself is bad and useless, not that what you want are good leaders. And if I may give a sort of illustration about this, in this century there have been two outstanding, very, very popular leaders, both referred to as good old Mac. One of them was the Tory millionaire, Macmillan, who was head of the Tory party, the man who told you you'd never had it so good. The other good old Mac was the darling of the left wing, Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of the first two Labour governments. And what did Ramsay MacDonald do? When capitalism was in crisis in 1931, good old Mac, the leader that the left-wingers had got elected in the first place, good old Mac carried a part of the Labour Party over to form a coalition government with the Tories in order to save capitalism from one of the crises into which it had descended. Now, of course, you've got another crisis, another very big one. This time it's going to be Harold Macmillan who's going to do it. And remember this, it's going to be Harold Wilson who's going to do this. And note this, Harold Wilson has got into power at the election a month before last with the backing of all of the left-wing organisations. All of them told the workers to vote for Harold Wilson, exactly as 40 or so years ago all the left-wingers were telling the workers that Ramsay MacDonald was the man they should trust. We have no use for leadership. It isn't a question of good or bad leadership, but leadership itself is bad. There were other things the SPGB rejected. It rejected completely an idea which was floating around at the time and is still floating around, that you don't have to do anything about capitalism because capitalism will destroy itself, an idea known as economic determinism. That the SPGB rejected it. It rejected minority action, the idea that you can have socialism without socialists, that you can impose socialism by dictatorship, or the idea that you can get socialism by general strike or insurrection. And particularly, of course, it rejected the idea that you can gradually change and humanize capitalism, solve all its problems one by one, and find at the end of the day that you have got what you wanted without actually ever having abolished capitalism. On the positive side, the SPGB said you need a politically organized socialist working class before you can have socialism. Its idea of socialism itself, a classless society, a non-coercive society, with production solely for use, no buying and selling, no frontiers and all the rest of it. This idea is the essential thing that the SPGB has kept alive all these years, and that it must be democratic. As socialism itself must be democratic, so must be the method of getting it. There was another thing that separated the SPGB from other organizations in 1904, and still does, that the SPGB said to the workers, look, you must not just be politically interested, you've got to get some understanding of how capitalism works. And what we said to them, the man who will give you the key is Marx, Marxian economics. Marxian economics have stood the test of time. Marx was right in his own day, and he's essentially right now. But immediately you come up against the people who argue that our capitalism's different now. What Marx said back in the 1860s and so on was quite right, but capitalism is a quite different sort of thing now. It's become changed, essentially changed. A lot of them will say there is no class struggle now. They'll say the workers are getting better off, and altogether you don't need to worry about Marx any longer. Well, as it happens, a book was recently published by a member of the Labour Party who puts this point of view. Is a man who, the book is, calls himself Bill Simpson. The book is Labour, the Unions and the Party meaning the Labour Party. He's General Secretary of a trade union and a member of the National Executive of the Labour Party. And what is interesting, Simpson puts this case. He says Marx was all right in his own day, but things are quite different now. And so therefore, to justify the Labour Party, he sets out to prove that Marx has no application now, that Marx is out of date. But he makes one interesting statement, and I'll quote it. He says about Marx in economics that Marx, and I quote, explained clearly how the capitalist system worked in a technical sense. His theory of surplus value cannot be faulted. Now remember this is what Simpson is saying about Marx. But when Simpson writes his book and tells the workers what to do now, he's forgotten all about this. He doesn't any longer look for Marx's explanation. He doesn't say, what I want to do to understand capitalism, I better go and have a look at Marx. He throws the whole thing overboard, as of course the Labour Party does, with this difference. Of course, the Labour Party never did accept Marx. Simpson says Marx has been proved wrong, and I can only mention one or two of the things. He says about the concentration of capital. He said, Marx said that capital would concentrate. The big firms would grow bigger, they would swallow up the smaller ones by amalgamation, or they would drive them out of existence. And Simpson says, you know, this just isn't true. Well, one can only wonder where Simpson's been hiding away from the world all this time. Everybody else knows, of course, particularly in recent years, it's a ceaseless stream of takeovers and mergers and small firms being pushed out of business. And by a stroke of luck, I read yesterday in the Times an article about the Building Society movement, right up to date, building societies in the news, and they sketch the history of the building societies. And they say that in 1883, which happens to be the year Marx died, there were 2,700 building societies. Marx's ideas obviously have carried on, after his death, because now there are only 450 of them. And moreover, 33 of them control 86% of the capital of the whole lot. In short, what in practice you've got, 2,700 have been replaced by 33. Simpson, of course, this is one of the things that Simpson doesn't know anything about. Simpson then goes on to elaborate his case to show again that although he thinks that Marx explained how capitalism works, he doesn't really believe it, because he said with the help of that economist Maynard Keynes, the man who said Marx not only completely wrong during Keynes' lifetime, but he was always wrong, that it never had application, Simpson says that with the help of Keynes, the Labour Party now has got capitalism under control. They've got it managed, and they can do what they like with it, that they can maintain full employment, and in particular that they have abolished crises. I might say in fairness to Simpson that he probably wrote his book about a year ago, because he goes on to say that Marx was wrong about crises, that there are no more crises ever with the help of Keynes, and that all we get now, and I quote his words, we don't get crises now, we get a few uncomfortable lurches. Well, these aren't the words that his leader Harold Wilson uses. Wilson says that this little lurch we've got now is the worst since the 1930s, that there is a new element of danger in it, and that in fact it has put democracy itself in peril. So Simpson had better get on to Wilson about this if he thinks it's a lurch. We've got news for him. Capitalist crises have not come to an end. They will continue. Capitalism is not under control, with or without the assistance of Maynard Keynes, and that Keynes, Simpson and the Labour Party have all been wrong, and Marx has been proved right, and the SPGB can claim that they are the people who have not only kept alive the idea of socialism, that they have kept Marxian economics to the fore when everybody else threw Marx overboard. In conclusion, I would just say this. We would say that the SPGB was right in 1904, that the SPGB principles were correct in 1904. We say they are still correct. And if I may put it this way, I would say that if the SPGB had never been in existence, and we were meeting here today to consider what to do about capitalism and the current little lurch that Simpson talks about, it would be necessary to form the SPGB now on the same principles that it had in 1904. I've now come to the end of my introduction. I'm going to call on Comrade Baltrop, who's going to deal in depth with a particular aspect, and the most important aspect of this, the powers of government. He will speak for something up to an hour. There will then be an opportunity for questions and discussion, but I have to remind you now, as I have to remind you later, that we've got to get out of this hall by 9:25. I now call on Comrade Baltrop.
Mr. Chairman, comrades and friends, Marx called the state the concentrated and organised power of society, and the society he was speaking of was, of course, capitalism. When you look at the factors which gave rise to the organised socialist movement in the latter part of the 19th century, a very considerable one, but one that can be overlooked, is the growth of the state itself. And the consequence of the growth of the state, the conviction which animated, as well as those who had formed the socialist movement, reformers of all kinds, that if you could get hold of these powers of government, then you could achieve almost anything. If you see how this animated men and movements in the latter part of the 19th century, you can contrast their frame of mind, say the people who formed the Social Democratic Federation and the Fabian Society, looking very keenly at the use of parliamentary power. Contrast their frame of mind with that of men who are thought of as socialist pioneers before Marx. People like Robert Owen and Thomas Hodgkin, who advanced stringent criticisms of capitalist society and proposals for organizing society differently, but who paid little or no attention to the idea of using Parliament. A further contrast can be made with that attitude at the end of the last century and the beginning of this, with the attitude of the new left, which has grown up in recent years, which professes to very largely reject parliamentary action. Parliament, they say, is no good. It can't serve the purposes of changing society. You have to see this, of course, as a condemnation not of parliamentary power, but of the left itself, past and present. Its continuing inanition, its emptiness, its substancelessness. And against this attitude, socialists maintain today, as they maintained in 1904, when the Socialist Party was founded, that parliamentary action is the only means to changing society fundamentally. At the beginning of the Socialist Party's existence, the trade unions were seeking political expression, and this was a question on which the founders of the Socialist Party were very anxious to formulate and declare their attitude as quickly as possible. And the reason why they were anxious to declare this attitude was, and you must understand this, that it wasn't and isn't an attitude simply to the trade unions as such, but to the whole question of capitalism and the state and the attainment of socialism. The importance of taking a position like this can be seen if, again, you make a comparison with that of the Independent Labour Party, which was strong in 1904. One of the objects of the ILP from its foundation in 1893 was to secure trade union representation in Parliament. But take that object and then see the attitude to the class struggle which was put forward by the ILP, and in particular by the ILP's leading spokesman, Keir Hardie, in the year that the Socialist Party was formed. In fact, very shortly after the Socialist Party was formed, in September 1904, he wrote a main article in their paper, The Labour Leader, in which he stated the attitude of the ILP to the class struggle. And he said simply this: I claim for the ILP that its socialism is above suspicion and its independence unchallenged and unchallengeable. Yet in the platform speeches and in the writings of its leading advocates, the terms class war or class conscious are rarely, if ever, used. So you see the difference between the two attitudes. The Socialist Party, at its foundation, was looking at the trade unions solely in terms of their working in the class struggle, of their taking part in the industrial side of the class struggle. But the people who advocated the trade unions getting into Parliament through the Labour Party, they weren't concerned with the class struggle, they were repudiating it. And they were seeing this action instead as simply a part of the broad reform movement. And the early members of the Socialist Party of Great Britain saw this very clearly, of course, and they saw also that for the trade unions to be politicised in this way, through forming the Labour Party, would compel them simply to support other parties and make whatever compromises they could to get concessions. And this has been the history not only of the Labour Party, but of other kinds of attempts at political action by the unions up to recent years. At the same time, the founders of the Socialist Party in 1904 used a phrase about Parliament which ought to be commented on. They didn't speak, and our principles still don't speak, of Parliament in itself. They speak of the machinery of government. But it was very quickly indeed made clear that by this they meant Parliament, local councils, that is, government as we know it. And in fact, up to 1910 or 1912, in the years preceding the First World War, questions about this were from time to time put to the Socialist Party and sent to the Socialist Standard, putting hypotheses. What would you do if Parliament weren't there? For instance, what would be the party's strategy if socialists found themselves in a country that had no Parliament? Or if in this country representation and suffrage were suddenly done away with? Well, these questions were hypotheses, but they've disappeared. Nobody has asked them for very many years. And they've disappeared for a practical reason in the face of facts. And the facts are simply that the many new nations that have come into being over that period, over the past 60 years, have all adopted parliaments. They have all adopted the kind of political machinery that the early members of the Socialist Party spoke of, making it plain that this legislative machinery was not just, as it were, a geographical and traditional accident, but an essential to the capitalist system. And indeed, it might be added that this has become so firmly planted in people's minds today that that kind of question has been replaced with another one, and the other one is, well, how could you possibly run socialism if you didn't have a government? So we have the pendulum swung the other way now. And as a further illustration about the need for parliamentary machinery, recently in the biography of John Strachey, the Labour leader who died a few years ago, there is an account of his being in 1956 in Poland at the time of the Poznan riots and at the time of changes in government. He was lecturing there on political theory and government, and he was taken aside by a statesman in Poland and asked this: "You, Mr. Strachey, are a well-known democratic theorist. We require your advice. We are extremely anxious to conduct absolutely free and democratic elections in our country. But if we do so, how can we ensure that the government's candidates will be at the top of the poll?" Well, this perhaps is the dilemma, but what is illustrated is the necessity for people who may be fundamentally thoroughly unwilling about it to have a legislative machinery to make capitalism function properly in their countries. It may be of interest to mention one other matter concerning Parliament which arose in the Socialist Party's early years. The members of that period were full of optimism. Indeed, in 1954, when we celebrated our 50th anniversary, we can recall elderly members saying they simply thought they would never see it. They thought that socialism would have been established before that time. And it was quite natural for them to consider questions implying rapid progress towards socialism and what would happen when the next step came. And one question which they considered was what would happen when the first socialists were elected to Parliament and were faced with the oath of allegiance to the Crown before they could take their seats. Well, the party conference, no doubt very much like the conference which has been taking place today, was quite hard-headed about this. They said, look, we are not going to let questions like this, meaningless constitutional forms, stop us doing what we intend to do. But there were some members who immediately left the party, convinced that at that early stage the party was going to be like some of the others, had put its feet on the slippery slopes of compromise by being prepared to swear an oath of allegiance. In fact, events in the 65 years since then have shown the good sense of the attitude taken and the meaninglessness of that particular constitutional form. If you want an illustration of it, well, in 1937, a parliament, 600-odd members, each of whom had sworn allegiance to the king, quite unanimously and without any twinges of conscience, gave him the sack for disobliging them. Fundamentally, the state is an executive for the ruling class. In its early days, this is what it was literally. That is, it comprised only well-established members of the ruling class. But within that executive, the different sectional interests of the ruling class produced, as they continue to produce, and I'll speak about this in a minute, a division of parties. And still at a relatively early stage, governments found that to a greater or lesser degree, they must have the consent of the governed. The alternative to obtaining this consent to measures which they must take would have been the permanent risk with a fast-growing population of civil disorder, and in particular the need to maintain perhaps too big a burden of suppressive legislation and force. As it was, if the mass of the people could be presented with a choice, look, we are going to do this, or alternatively, we are going to do that. Now you tell us which of the two you would prefer. Then the consent of the majority of the governed had been obtained, and this was found to be a practical way of getting over the difficulties of administering the state in the early part of the 19th century. Therefore, democracy was pressed upon the working class. Although I've said it was pressed upon the working class, that is no denigration of democracy. Having been pressed upon the working class, of course, it was to become eventually its invaluable weapon, because it offers the means to control of the governing machinery. Now, I've spoken about differences between parties. It's easy to see how these existed when government consisted of members of the ruling class. But they remain, and they remain today as differences to a very large extent over taxation. That is, how the money collected by taxation to finance the state is to be obtained and used. Now, the Socialist Party has a unique and long-standing attitude to taxation, and it's simply that despite all the appearances, taxation is not a matter of any consequence to the working class. Where the main form of it, direct taxation, is concerned, it can be said that large numbers of workers are aware of this themselves, in that they are at least aware that their wages are not some theoretical gross payment, but simply what they get at the end, after deductions, as it's said. Workers don't go along and ask for wage rises through their unions on the basis of the theoretical payment they get. They go along and ask on the basis of the net payment, what they actually get in their pocket, what's called take-home pay. And this, of course, is what wages are. We have always said this, that taxation is not a matter that the working class should take into account, because it does not concern or affect the workers. And something similar can be said of indirect taxation. But the important point to be seen is that in practice taxes are collected not from the workers but from the capitalist class. The state is theirs and they finance it. And as has been said, the differences among political parties which seek to govern are, to a very large extent, differences over how you obtain this money, what section of the capitalist class you go to rake in most substantially from, and what you do with it, what are your priorities in expenditure when you've got it. And one thing which might be said in addition to this is that you must realize that differences do exist. It's very commonly said, well, the Labour Party and the Tory Party, there's no difference between them. in a wide sense that they both stand for the continuation of capitalism. Of course, this is true, but it simply isn't true to say that there are no differences among the parties. You should realize that these exist and what their nature is. Now, I spoke at the beginning about the growth of state power in the second part of the 19th century. This shouldn't be taken to mean that the state has been more or less strong at different times. What was meant was the widening of state power, the widening of what it's had to deal with. If you look at the changes in this widening sense since the foundation of the Socialist Party or since the 1890s, in what the state has had to deal with. For example, the state has had to, all governments have had to legislate and provide for an expanding education system, for an immense growth of road traffic which simply didn't exist in the 1890s or at the beginning of the century, the planning of towns, which has as its secondary objective trying to give some stability and location to populations, housing, which hardly existed at the beginning of the century as a function of government, but is now an important one of it, and innumerable other things which have come in since that time, and all of these are effected and controlled through local government. As the needs have changed and grown, local government has had to be reorganized repeatedly, including a very recent reorganization. It's natural, when one is speaking of the powers of government, to think only of mighty matters and perhaps to pooh-pooh local councils with their components of the greengrocer down the road and the little man from round the corner, and to think, well, these people and the bodies which they sit on are not part of the powers of government. But that is mistaken. Local councils are branches of central government, and their function is to execute the policies which central government has and decides on. Their position is formulated by the acts which establish them. They're limited to this. Their powers are given them by central government. They have no others. And they're further connected to central government by the system of financial support. It may be interesting in connection with the policies of governing parties to illustrate this just a little. When a party is elected to power by a working class which is attracted by one particular promise, let us say a Labour government elected on the promise that it will have 400,000 houses built. Obviously the electors are likely to be people in areas where they're conscious that there's a very considerable housing need. And these people will obviously assume that some change in the circumstances around them are likely to take place. We are going to get more houses from a Labour government. And they're astonished to find that this doesn't materialise very often. And what happens is that the houses, of course, aren't provided by the Labour Party at Westminster, they're provided by the local council. The local council very often takes the new government at its word. It has to submit its project annually to the ministry for approval. And having got the approval, it then requires the money. And so they will happily submit to the new government and its Ministry of Housing a project saying, well, you said you were going to build lots more houses. In this district, we want to build 500 houses next year. And they are quite likely to get back a note from the Ministry of Housing saying, go to blazes, you can build 50. And the reason for this is that although we're going to build all the houses we said we would, we didn't mention it at the time, but of course we're going to build them somewhere else. We're going to build them in northeast England to try to attract industry and population there. We don't dream of building them down here for all the people who voted for us. And this is how local government works, effecting policies of central government willy-nilly. And it has no choice but to execute the intentions as well as the policies of the state and the party which is in control. Now, one reason for giving that illustration is to make the point that at both the local or the central level, those engaged in this machinery have no choice but to comply with what is in the interests of capitalism. Comrade Hardy, in his opening address, gave some indications of this. He mentioned the former Labour leader, Ramsay MacDonald. I've always thought an outstanding example of this, of course, was at the outbreak of the 1914-18 war, when right on the outbreak of war, the Labour leaders of Europe actually got together and swore themselves blue that the workers they led in the countries they'd come from were not going to support any war. They then went back individually to their various countries and supported the war efforts of their particular countries. And you look at this not as Labour leaders who went away, told lies to one another and then to their followers, but see it as people who might have had an intention, who might have had what they no doubt would have called an ideal, but when it came down to it, were face to face with the practicalities of capitalism. If you support the capitalist system, what are you going to do when it's in crisis? You have no choice but to support it. And this was the position of the Labour leaders in 1914, and in every year, in every month, ever since this. And to come back to what happens from day to day in the business of the state and government under capitalism, see what the two standard excuses of governments are reflecting this. The first one is, if they are criticised, that they were having to clean up the mess. In other words, put right the errors of their predecessors and try to get the system into as good order as can be done. The second one is that public money, that is the taxpayers' money, has been used for the wrong purposes. And both of these reflect the inevitability, the problem, which is inescapable from all people who take on the running of capitalism. There is one other point which I should mention, although it doesn't contribute to the structure of what I'm saying, but I think it may be of interest, about a built-in safeguard to the British parliamentary system, but it isn't unique to the British system. It's often asked and made a criticism of governments why, with all of their different departments, for food and housing and aviation and all of the other things they have, why they never have experts in charge of these departments, why they always have complete amateurs. If you get a fellow in Parliament who knows all about aviation, then he's likely to be put in charge of the environment or something he doesn't know anything about. And this is commonly pointed out as if it were some kind of blind spot in all governments. Well, in fact, it is, as I've said, a built-in safeguard to the system. What you have to see is that the ministers in charge of various government departments function first and foremost as members of the government as a whole, and only secondarily in relation to the things they're in charge of. And if they had this overriding knowledge and passion for a particular subject, then, of course, they would pay relatively little attention to the needs of the system as a whole. If I can give two examples, one actual and one possible of this. As the actual example, in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a famous mine workers leader named A.J. Cook, an agitator of the time. And it was said of Cook, he was interested in nothing at all but mines and mine workers, that he thought the whole world was an enormous coal mine covered by grass. Well, had he actually been put in charge, he was never in a government, of a ministry, then he couldn't possibly have functioned as a member of the government as a whole, because he'd have said, well, is this any good to coal miners, never mind the rest of the population? To give the possible example, there is today, of course, a great deal of concern about what's called the environment, and we have a Ministry of the Environment, or a department as they call it now, and here again it can be said, why don't we have an ecologist, an environmental enthusiast in charge of this? Well, you can very readily see what would happen. When he came to function as a member of the government, he couldn't, because he'd say straight away, what is all this about economic affairs? It means growth. Well, we can't have that. What is all this about from the Minister of Transport? It means pollution of the roads and the atmosphere. We can't have that. And so, of course, the British parliamentary system and others imitating it have always had to take this into account. But what you must see is that the person who asks this question is mistaken as to what is really going on in government. The ministries are not departments which exist in vacuums. They are adjuncts to the much wider, the first and foremost work of government as a whole. During the Socialist Party's lifetime, our case about government has been confirmed again and again. As Comrade Hardy has told you, parties and individuals who were going to engage in running capitalism, but try to do so in the working class's interests instead of capital's, have failed without exception. And their failure has led to continual letdowns for the workers who believed them, believing that perhaps this time it would be different. And in times of crises, wars and major depressions, and I've already spoken of the 1914 war, but it applies, of course, to the Second World War, indeed to any other war that you care to think of, where there has been a critical situation for capitalism generally. In times of crises, then the parties have forgotten their differences, immediately flown to their common ground, and united to defend capitalism's interests. And there has also, throughout capitalism, been agreement among the parties, whatever they may have disagreed on first types of legislation, such as welfarism, and second, particular theories of running capitalism, in the last 30 or 35 years, Keynesism, which have been held to or have appeared to support capitalism's interest best. It should be added too that our case has been confirmed also by the history of those who set themselves against the state. I said at the outset that the new left of recent years has taken a posture of rejecting the use of Parliament, and there remain those at all times who refuse to accept that the coercive force of the state, backed by the electorate, is a firm one. Well, examples of people who've tried this and failed to confirm what we said to them before they tried it are, in particular in recent times, rebel councils who've refused to carry out legislation, and the people like the Angry Brigade who tried direct action, launching themselves against the power of the state, to find that against it they were quite insignificant. And you will see, if any of you come across or have an opportunity to see, the statements being made a couple of years ago by the Angry Brigade and their supporters, the truculence and the defiance, the things that they were going to do, and the impotence of the state against them, which very rapidly turned to whining and to saying the state was persecuting them. And this indeed, the state was going for them as hard as it could, but this indeed was what the state will always do to people who don't recognize its strength. Reform movements have, by their nature, continually to apply to governments for concessions and improvements. And throughout our lifetime, as the Socialist Party, we've been urged to support them on this and that ground because of this and that special case. Well, part of our case about reforms is that what has to be judged is not the thing which in fact we're always asked to support, the broad appeal, the protest made at the outset, but the legislation when it turns up, the legislation which is eventually formulated. And again, what has to be seen is that when governments do legislate, they don't legislate for theoretical reasons, that is, on moral or humanitarian grounds. They legislate on entirely practical ones. And this is the reason why reformers are continually disappointed in their hopes, and their intentions turn sour upon them. Not very long ago, and I'm afraid I can't remember the name of it, but it doesn't matter, a book was published reviewing the welfare state and expressing people's disappointment in it. And they all state what their expectations were from it. But if you look back to the inauguration of the welfare state, why on earth did they expect these things from it? There was no earthly reason why they should. And yet here are all of them, 25 or more years later, saying we are disappointed, we are let down. And this, again, confirms what the Socialist Party has always said about reforms as well as about government, that if somebody comes along with a protest or an appeal and says, support us, then you say, well, never mind about your appeal. What is going to result from this? What are governments going to make from it? We don't want to hear your appeal. We want to see in black and white what is going to come out of it. And this, of course, is precisely what reformers never do want to see, and this is part of the reason why we have always refused to go along with this kind of appeal. Finally, Mr. Chairman, it must be realized that the powers of government are coercive powers. Behind the clerks, behind the administrators, and behind the most inane politicians stand prisons and armed force as the ultimate sanction for the capitalist system and what it thinks it needs. Majorities of the electorate give their support to the powers of government and to the coercion which supports them because those majorities support capitalism. And something which must be recognized too about this majority support is that even dictatorships require it. Dictatorships have to have it too, to get themselves on their feet. A movement to change society through the use of Parliament is realistic only when it realizes this fact, and therefore seeks to muster an electorate which no longer supports capitalism but wants it abolished. Such an electorate can then send its representatives to Parliament with a new kind of mandate, not to run capitalism but to abolish it. When we speak about the powers of government, we are often told by people who support direct action in particular, would the capitalist class really let this happen? Would they let you send delegates to Parliament as representative of the socialist working class? Would they so quietly let this happen? But this is the whole point. This is the point. For the socialist working class to go to where the power of capitalism resides, to where the coercive machine exists and is controlled. If that is done, then whatever the will may be, no other will than that of the conscious majority can prevail. And that is the whole case for a socialist majority that the Socialist Party has presented throughout its existence to obtain and use control of the machinery of government for the establishment of socialism. There is no other way.
It's in two parts. The opening question was that we say that we're against all idea of leadership, but the questioner then says, but we went on to talk about government. Well, let me deal with these two things separately. The SPGB's attitude towards leadership is that until workers have got into the habit of thinking for themselves and making their own decisions, they are not going to get socialism. In fact, they are not going to get their interests looked after. That it isn't a question of whether the leader in whom they put trust is genuine, sincere, and all the rest of it, or whether he isn't. It's the workers who have got to make the final decisions. It's got to be the workers who decide they want socialism. It's got to be the workers who, having achieved, got control of political power and introduced socialism. They are the people who are going to have to run it. And only people who have taken the responsibility of thinking these things out for themselves can do these jobs. Now, that's our attitude on leadership. But then the questioner goes on to say, we talked about government. Well, this is something that you see that Comrade Baltrop dealt with. We didn't say that we are going to have a government which is going to introduce socialism. Comrade Baltop emphasised, as the SPGB always does, that it's got to be a socialist working class who makes these decisions. The socialist working class has got to dispossess the capitalist class, and to do this, they've got to get control of the machinery of government, but not in order to put in a different kind of government. They have got to, having got power and cleared the way for socialism, they then got to take on the great responsibility of running the world on a socialist basis. So it seems to me that the questioner has not really understood what case the SPGB is putting on these two things. He understands the first part about not having leadership, but he doesn't understand what the SPGB is saying about government and the separate question, the need to gain control of the machinery of government. The socialist idea is that socialism is going to be a non-coercive system of society in which people will cooperate voluntarily to carry on production and distribution, not being directed to do so by somebody whom he would call the government. The questioner, in fact, has got to look more deeply into this to understand what the party's case is on it.
Question to repeat it is, in brief, I think, and it did start so promisingly, that we have had 70 years of capitalist parties. The questioner then speaks of Parliament being set free to be used for the establishment of socialism, and says the trouble is that MPs are bound to their parties, that they are, to use the common phrase, lobby fodder, that if they could vote in secret, then many of the problems would be solved, they would be freed. And he refers to the bribery of voters in the 19th century. As far as that last matter is concerned, I'm not sure that the difference today is so very considerable. I don't always know what happens in town areas. I live in a country area. But I do see that the great attraction of the Conservative Party in the country area that I live in is that it gives a handsomer tea and a bigger coach outing to the electorate every year. Not quite the same as pickaxe handles, but I'm sure that the encouraging effect is there. But would it make any difference if members of Parliament could vote in secret? Well, you see, what you are looking at is the members of Parliament and not the electorate. What would members of Parliament do if they could vote in secret? Let us have a look, if you like, at some particular MP. Say Fred Higgins, who has just been elected for Chipping Sudbury as a Tory MP, and we know, as the questioner says, that he is going to trot in and out of the division lobbies, and indeed Fred Higgins' dog would do almost as well. And the questioner says, surely, if Fred Higgins could vote without his party leaders knowing what he was up to, then this would make everything different. But, in fact, Fred Higgins went to Parliament on the condition that he supported capitalism. He didn't go to Parliament as a socialist. He may have gone as a Labour MP, he may have gone as a Tory, he may have gone, as perhaps our questioner would like him to, as an independent. But he hasn't gone as a socialist. He has not been sent there by an electorate that wants the capitalist system abolished. Now, if he is sent there by such an electorate, there is no problem whether his vote is secret or is public. He has gone there with a mandate for one thing only. If he hasn't, it doesn't make any difference whether he votes at the behest of the whips or according to his own wishes, because in fact they're likely to be identical. Look, this is another version of the question. Would it be better if there were honest men instead of crooks in Parliament? Well, there are many honest men in Parliament, people who go there hoping that their love of fair play will become a byword. And what do? They do exactly the same things as the MPs whose names are a byword for similarity to Horatio Bottomley. They do exactly the same. You see, this kind of thing is an irrelevance, and to keep to this point of the honesty of members of Parliament, if you like, there have been many honest and charming and decent people in Parliament who did exactly the same as if they'd been rogues. I have known, say, a Communist Party leader who was a most charming and honest and decent fellow, and he told the same whopping and self-contradictory lies as if he'd been a rogue like most other Communist Party leaders. Well, you see, it's a question not of the intention of the individual MP, it's a question of the people who elect him. Unless they are people who want to be represented in Parliament, who are in fact delegating him consciously to bring about a change in society, then his intentions don't really matter. And if his own personal preferences are supplanted by the wishes of a party, then there is no great difference either. If I can just finish by giving one example over this, so there's one other thing I want to say. One example over this. A few years ago, there was an outstanding example of members of Parliament acting as lobby fodder over the possible creation of the third London airport at Stansted, when a lot of members of the Labour Party said, we are not going to stand for this, we're going to vote against it. And there was a Labour government in power. And Wilson said, go on, get out of it, into the lobby, quick. And they did. They trotted into the lobby. Their consciences disappeared. But see what these people wanted. They didn't want any fundamental change. All they wanted was an airport to be put somewhere else and not at Stansted. And if they'd had it somewhere else, the process would have been repeated. In short, there was really no difference worth talking about. It was a difference of individual preference, but it was not a difference of attitudes towards society. There is one other important thing to be added about this. The questioner may believe that an advantage to society would be gained by secrecy. We say that no advantage is ever gained by secrecy. This is the stock in trade of leaders. And although he can see this possible advantage that members of Parliament wouldn't now be going in and out at the behest of their leaders there, what about the advantage, or otherwise, to the working class of having members of Parliament without the faintest idea of how they were voting? The representatives you put there, who thus become irresponsible to you. And in fact, an important aspect of the Socialist Party's case during our lifetime has been that we are against secrecy in politics in any respect whatever. We have no secret meetings, we have no secret votes. Everything that we do is on show before the public, as it were. This is something which no other political party can claim. And this is something which, if the alternative is presented to us as a virtue, sorry, we say, secrecy can never be a virtue and can never be to the interests of the working class.
If we say it can be achieved with the ballot box, what's your answer to Chile? Mariente's government in Chile.
If we say it can be achieved through the ballot box,
see, what he's saying is that they tried to do it in Chile by the ballot box.
Well, three questions which I'll repeat as I go along. The first one, and I'll answer them briefly because of the passage of time. The first one is that since I pointed out that it isn't true that there are no differences between the Tory and the Labour Party, the questioner doesn't understand why we don't exercise a preference for the Labour Party. Well, the answer is very simply that to recognise that there are differences between them is not to imply that one must therefore have a preference. Both do stand for the running of the capitalist system. We do not want the capitalist system, and therefore it is quite pointless for us to say we would rather have capitalism run by Labour than by the Conservative Party. If you want examples of the kind of thing that we mean by differences, for example, when it comes to housing and the money allocated to housing, and if you recall, I spoke of the differences as being largely financial differences. The Conservative Party's housing policies will be directed more towards the building of private houses than council houses. The Labour Party's housing policies will be the opposite, directed more towards the building of council houses than private ones. But these are not differences which are worth our or anybody else's considering. overall, both parties are incapable of solving the housing problem. Why, therefore, should we support them on such a ground as that, even though it is a difference? Why, in fact, should we support any party which stands for capitalism when you consider it's not just a case of the capitalist system in itself, because it's the capitalist system, but because of the consequences of the capitalist system? Look at this. We're opposed to capitalism because of its effects, not because of itself. When a person becomes a socialist, he begins by objecting to wars, to unemployment, to the poverty which in greater or lesser degree all working people live with, to all the problems consequent on poverty, like housing and illness and poor education, to the fact that a working class life is a bloody rotten life. This is where people start from. And from that point, then they come to the word capitalism. And if you see those things as the consequences of capitalism, regardless of who it's administered by, then what's the point of a preference? The second question is, pardon?
Until socialism, as I understand it, can be established, and I do want it established, but as I understand it, then during that time, if we do care about the state of the working people, then we, until we are in a position to bring socialism in, then one party, if one party is better, then we should.
All right. The questioner puts a supplementary question. He says, well, he too wants socialism. What I have said is humanitarian material, but until socialism can be realized, in the meantime, we must strive, I think you're saying, to make things better.
I'm saying that if you care for people, which I thought you do, then during the period up until socialism can be established, then you should choose the party that will care most.
That will do more for the working class. Look, very briefly, first, our appeal is not and has never been a humanitarian one. We stand for, and what I was speaking about just now, as the effects of capitalism, the material interests of the working class. When I say that war is an effect of capitalism, the condemnation of war is not a humanitarian one. The condemnation of war is a fact, pure and simple kind of thing. It is not in the interests of the working class to get killed in millions. It is not in the interests of the working class to have insufficient food, clothing and shelter. This is not humanitarianism. This is cold and hard fact. Now, as for the meantime, until we get socialism, well, this is a question which has been put to us again and again during our lifetime. What you must see is that if everybody takes this standpoint, the meantime is infinite. It never ends, because people will support capitalism and contribute to its sustenance for the meantime, and of course socialism never becomes possible. And unfortunately, you see, during our lifetime, not hundreds, but many, many thousands of people have put precisely this question to us. They've said, look, I am a socialist, but I want something done while we're waiting for socialism. If every one of those people had said, I am a socialist, I'll come in with you, the meantime would have ended long ago. We'd have had socialism long ago. The second question, capitalism can't work for the working class. Well, what about Sweden and Denmark? Well, I don't know anything about Sweden and Denmark except that they are capitalist countries. Not very long ago, I was talking to someone from Norway who laughed and said, you know what they say about the Swedes in Norway, that they're the most regimented people on earth. But, in fact, this is something which we've been told continually. In Sweden, they have state capitalism. The means of production are owned in the same way as they are elsewhere. The standard of living of the working class is possibly a little bit higher through administration by the state, but the position of the worker in Sweden is fundamentally exactly the same as the position of the worker anywhere else, and likewise in Denmark too. Third, the use of the ballot box as exemplified in Chile. The questioner says, if socialism can be obtained by electoral means, what about Chile? Implying, I think, that people tried in Chile to establish socialism and this was got rid of. Well, this simply isn't true. What people voted for in Chile was a communist politician who sought to establish state capitalism, had he been successful. Of course, he was overthrown, but all the same, had he not been overthrown, then the people of Chile, even with a majority government for poor old Allende, would have been in the same position as people living in communist regimes elsewhere. They would have been living in state capitalism, many of them working for state enterprises instead of private ones, and finding there was absolutely no difference. Don't confuse state capitalism with socialism. There is absolutely no similarity.
I repeat the points made by the questioner. First, the questioner says, we say that the SPGB has an attitude towards reforms. We don't support the idea of trying to reform capitalism. So what do we say about the Amalgamated Engineering Union and the fight they put up against the Industrial Relations Act? He then went on to say, why don't people pull together? And in general, what have we got to say about this situation? Well, of course, it raises a whole lot of questions. But remember this, that as Comrade Baltrop's already pointed out, if you are going in for a reformist program, you are going to extend the meantime forever, and you are not going to solve your problems. This is the framework in which you're looking at this about reforms. Take this idea, I'm coming back in a sense to what the last question about reforms and making choices. In 1906, one of the leading people, a trade union official incidentally, in forming the Labour Party, made a statement. He said, look, don't worry about socialism, let's get on with practical problems. And the practical problems then they were named. One was housing. Has the housing problem been solved? Nearly 70 years ago. Keir Hardie said that one of the first things they were going to do was to deal with war and disarmament. Been dealt with? Not at all. I mean, the destructive capacity of weapons of war now is about 1,000 times what it was at the time that Keir Hardie said, let's be practical, let's deal with these problems one by one. This is the sort of reforming you're up against. They were going to deal with unemployment. Unemployment hasn't been dealt with in spite of what I said earlier about Mr. Bill Simpson thinking that with the help of Maynard Keynes they've solved the unemployment problem. Of course they haven't solved it. They were going to, by the way, another thing, they were going to solve the workers' problems with nationalisation, and one of the things they were going to do, they were going to say that if you get nationalisation, the workers will get higher pay and there won't be any strikes. Well, I ask you, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of strikes. You could take a position last year where nearly all the nationalised industries were on strike together. You ask the workers in the nationalised industries what they think about nationalisation. They know it hasn't solved any problem. And this is, you've got to take this reformist business as a whole. We say to the working class, look, your problems need that you get rid of capitalism. We were saying this when we were formed in 1904. We said to them, look, if you don't decide to get rid of capitalism, your problems will not be solved. Well, remember this. We were not the only people in this. We had the opponents like David Shackleton and the others and Keir Hardie who were saying, look, not only if you give us Labour Party, not only will we improve capitalism and solve its problems, but we will also give you the socialism that you want at the end of the road. I will point out something to you. If any of you go to trade union conferences now, or read Labour Party literature now, references to socialism have always disappeared. You can meet members of the Labour Party now who don't know what we're talking about when we talk about socialism. Years ago, I mean, I can remember back before the war, there were lots of members of the Labour Party who at least did know something about what socialism meant. And they would argue then, yes, we'll accept your idea of socialism, it will be got through the Labour Party. You never hear Labour Party people talking like this now. That is the whole background of this Labour Party business. Now, when you come to a particular issue, like the Industrial Relations Act, you've got to get a few things in mind. Comrade Baltrop has dealt with the position that power is political. Power rests with the people who control the machinery of government and the armed forces. And nothing exemplifies this more clearly than this business of the Industrial Relations Act. There may be other reasons. One of the major reasons why the Tories wanted the Industrial Relations Act, and I remind any of you who've got any illusions on it, it wasn't the employers who wanted it. When Barbara Castle issued her in place of strife, the TUC and the Confederation of British Industries issued a joint statement saying they did not want any major changes in the trade union law. That was the position. If you want the answer, the Tories thought they saw, and it's happened previously, they thought they saw a chance of winning an election by, to use their language, standing up to the trade unions. This was a very large issue in having the Industrial Relations Act at all. And of course Harold Wilson was thinking the same. It's been placed on record by conversation between Victor Feather and I think it was Cecil King, that Victor Feather said at that time that what Wilson was after was what the Tories were after. They both thought that they could win an election by standing up to the trade union. You've got to remember, most workers are not in trade unions, and the Tory party estimates, I've no doubt it's an exaggeration, that 40% of trade unionists vote Tory. So it isn't when the questioner says, why don't people all stand together? Well, because the working class do not stand together, and there is only one issue on which they could ever possibly stand together, and that's to have socialism and get rid of capitalism. But the workers aren't like that. They've got all sorts of subsidiary things in their mind. Now, about legislation to alter trade union law, come back to what Comrade Baltrop said about where power resides. In, was it last year, an issue arose about the 5 jailed dockers. And there were people who didn't really understand the situation, who said, look, the Trade Union Congress threatened to have a one-day strike, and the government got the wind up, and the government immediately released the dockers. This is, of course, nonsense. It was the government were trying to get the dockers out before the TUC even decided to hold their one day, not of strikes, but what they called protests and demonstrations. The government did not want those dockers in jail. It was a mistake by, as has happened repeatedly through capitalist history. Some bullet-headed judge gives a silly decision and lands the government in difficulties, and they saw this with the dockers. The government solicitor rushed round to the prison as soon as they were in and said, we're applying to get you out. And as I say, it was a race whether they could get them out before the TUC could hold their meeting. But all right, people could, you might say, and people could say, yes, you know, but if the government hadn't released them, the TUC would have threatened the government. They'd said, look, if you don't release these people from prison, we will have a day of protest and demonstration. In fact, we may get them, as the records show, the most that they've got on any occasion, including the AEU in the last 3 years, when they've had political strikes, is about $1.25 million. They're saying to the government, look, if you don't release these dockers, we'll get $1.25 million workers to take a day off work and lose their pay on it, by the way. Have you noticed there are a number of trade unionists who've been in jail since last December, the pickets? Why didn't the AEU and the TUC and all the other unions say, you let those people out or we'll strike? Here you've got a different situation. This was through the normal process of law. Incidentally, they were not jailed under the Industrial Relations Act, but under common law. The government was saying the law is going to take its course and we're not going to let those people out. So what happened? On the 10th of December, a certain event was announced. In London, where I lived, there were posters on the wall. I'm asking a rhetorical question. How many of you people who are members of trade unions came out on strike on the 10th of December, which was the day announced, all out to get the pickets out of jail? According to the press, the number of people who came out was about 20,000. But I mean, even if it had been 1 million, the government still would not have given way on that issue. They wanted them in. And what has happened since? The AU has been mentioned. The AU have got some sponsored members in Parliament. What have they been doing? They were raising the question in Parliament, and strange as it may seem, they were claiming that these people being in jail, it wasn't only AEU MPs, other MPs, they're saying, it was contrary to trade union law. But what else have they been doing? This last week they've gone cap in hand to the Home Secretary, and they haven't said to him, look, if you don't let these people out, we're going to call all the workers out on strike, because they know very well the workers would not come. I mean, they might get 1 million out for a day or two. and the TUC doesn't want it, they've been going on to the Home Secretary, cap in hand, and saying, will you please reduce these sentences? We think they're excessive. And what is this a lesson? The lesson of this is, it is political power, the people who control the state machine, who dominate society. Trade unions could cause an enormous amount of trouble to the capitalist class, but if it is a vital issue for the capitalist class, the people who've got control of the machinery of government, or can get control of it, will dominate and will win on an issue like this. I would throw on one other word, merely rather a side issue. The history of the trade union movement is not nearly as bad as some people think that it is. I would say that at least half the time that the trade unions have been in existence, which is now a century and 3/4, at least half the activities of the trade unions have been completely illegal. What has happened? Wise, astute workers in trade unions with experience have learned in the past how to test a situation. They don't try to confront a government because that means confronting the people who've got real power. What they do, they wait till they act unobtrusively, or they wait till the atmosphere changes, or wait till the capitalist class are busy with something else, like when the capitalists are busy at war, and the trade unions then ignore the law and do it with impunity. But we would be failing in our duty if we didn't say to the workers all the time, look, recognize where power exists. Trade unions have, if they really work together on an issue, they've got power to, so to speak, to hamper capitalism and cause a lot of hardship to themselves and everybody else. Incidentally, the people who are least affected by it are the capitalists themselves. But if it is a question of getting power, you've got to get control of the machinery of government, and you can't with impunity defy the people who've got it. Again, look at one other thing. I mustn't speak too long on this. Look at what's happened to all the amendments of the Trade Union Act. In the existence of the SPGB, there was the 1906 Act. Incidentally, under the Taft-Bale decision, which was remedied in 1906, the fines imposed on unions, if you take into account the fact that prices are now about 10 times what they were then, the fines imposed on unions were ever so much greater than they are now. And what did the trade unions do? What had they to do? They went along to the Liberal Party and did a deal with the Liberals. They said, look, you change the law, then you can count on us advising our members to vote Liberal, which they did. 1913, they did it again over the political levy. 1927, when the Tories introduced the 1927 Trade Disputes Act, after the general strike, by the way, don't get the idea, so to speak, you can have a general strike and get the capitalists to give way, as it were. You got the thing the other way round. They had a general strike. It was defeated. The capitalist class then introduced the 1927 Act, and in spite of all the protests, the demands for strikes, the meetings, and all the rest of it, they had to wait till 1946 before they got it repealed. And they did it again, another deal with the capitalist party, this time the Labour Party. And now they've done another deal. They didn't get rid of the Industrial Relations Act by threatening the capitalist class. They fixed up this compact. They went to Wilson. They were doing it before, while the Tories were still in office. They said, look, let's form a social compact. You give us certain things, including the repeal of the Industrial Relations Act. We'll give you the backing of the trade union movement. We'll tell our members to vote Labour. We'll give you a lot of money. And do you realise what one of these things is? One of these things is the tacit acceptance of even the Tories' Phase 3 wages policy. It was announced last week. Michael Foot, the new left-winger who's going to change the nature of society, the pay board told a couple of unions that they cannot have the increases that they have already agreed with the employer, and the employer, in fact, has got to take the money back again. This is announced by Michael Foot. This is part of the compact that the trade unions have entered into. They have said to the government, well, you repeal the the Industrial Relations Act for us, we'll give you the backing of the workers, and it is a comprehensive thing. They've taken the lot together, and part of it is they are telling the great mass of the workers, not the miners, they're telling the great mass of the workers, moderate your wage claims. This is the reality of capitalism.
Well, summarise the question. The questioner says, bearing in mind that the establishment of socialism requires a majority of the working class on an international scale, what would our policy or our strategy be if we found ourselves with just over 50% of the seats, I think you said, and 100% of the electorate?
First of all, I'm talking about on an internal scale.
Yes. If we had a bare majority in Parliament. Yes. Yep. If we had a bare majority of socialist delegates in Parliament, what would we do towards the rest of the world? Well, the supposition, which is not a new one to us, I'd say two things about it. The first one is that this supposition always excludes anything similar having happened in the rest of the world. And, of course, this is a supposition which is quite groundless, because whenever a social movement of strength takes place in one part of the world having particularly become what one modern philosopher calls a global village, then it's the concomitant changes of consciousness take place very quickly indeed in other parts of the world. In other words, the supposition that there would be a socialist majority, whether substantial or slight, in one part of the world and nothing much resembling it elsewhere, is one which we don't entertain. The second one is, what would we do in such a hypothetical position? And this is a question which, in fact, we don't answer, not because we haven't got an answer, but because the implications of our having an answer are ones which are contrary to the implications of socialism. Look, this is similar to a question which we're often asked, tell us what socialism would be like. And people often press us about this. If you can describe the socialist world in detail, then you've got a winner. People won't support you because they don't know what it's going to be like. Well, of course, this is a very plausible argument until you see the part of the statement that's been missed out. Because if we were to start saying to people, this is what socialism will be like, we, all the few hundred of us, what's the bit we've missed out? What's the other half of the sentence? Whether you like it or not, we have decided. And so, however attractive and plausible this, it is not any business of ours to say it. That sort of decision is going to be made by the people who find themselves with socialism, what kind of world they want it to be like. And similarly with this question here, what would we do if we had in Britain, how many, 20 million socialists or something like that, a bare majority, to sustain a bare majority in Parliament? It is impossible for us, the few hundred of us, to announce what the 20 million socialists who haven't yet come into being would decide in substantially changed circumstances. And this is why questions like this, it's not a question of not being able to project an answer, it is a question that it would be irrelevant and insolent for us to try to answer them. This, in fact, is the question that wants the leadership answer. It wants us to say, look, this is what you are going to do. And this is the thing which we don't say. We say, on the contrary, when we have conscious socialists, they will decide what they are going to do. The chairman has suggested 2 minutes to 9:20. Director, I might answer this briefly and make it also the occasion for the concluding remarks, so that you may all go home happy or dissatisfied or whatever your frame of mind may be. The questioner says, does not the bringing into being of socialism presuppose a change in the nature of human beings? Well, there are so many things that can be said about this. The first one is that changes in the nature of human beings are taking place constantly. What the questioner is really supposing is that the nature of human beings is a fixed entity. We do not find this. It is not something which can be supported. On the contrary, we find that throughout human history, not merely ancient history, but history within our times, within our lifetimes, Human nature has continually changed. Human views and aspirations have continually changed. Second, of course, it is not human nature that we seek to change. What I have just said has been an observation on what takes place anyway. What we seek to change is consciousness, and that too changes all the time. And during the Socialist Party's lifetime, people's consciousness also have changed. I would say this to you. There are, I said a few hundred members of the Socialist Party, not really 200. Things aren't as bad as that. There are, in fact, very large numbers of people who will come along to us as a questioner down here said. I am a socialist, yes, I like the kind of prospect that you talk about, but it's a long way off. Well, when somebody talks to us like this means he is one of the many who say to us, well, look, the trouble is I'm looking over my shoulder. When you show me a lot of other people who are going that way too, I will come along with them as well. And the world is full of people looking over their shoulders. And I would say that the world is full of people who are not by any means such a long way from consciousness of the need for and the realizability of socialism as you may think. This has nothing at all to do with human nature, though insofar as the nature of man comes into it, I would say this, that if you have in mind that ideas are all that matter, well, indeed, if we waited for the realization of an idea, we might wait a very long time. But on the contrary, the socialism in itself means the expression of the material interests, and I said this earlier, of people. And it is material interests which drive people to become socialists. It's when people perceive not an idea, but the world around them, that they begin to look at the possibilities of changing this. Certainly, the Socialist Party has a function in helping to create that consciousness, but capitalism is part of that function too. It's from capitalism as well as primarily, in fact, more than anything else, which creates socialists. Now, finally, and to close up, this meeting has been about the powers of government. What we have endeavoured to do in this meeting has been to speak about political power and to make the single point, besides talking about just how that power operates, to make the single point that given the capitalist organisation of society, then all power rests in the hands of those who control the political machinery. Wanting to change society, we must therefore look at a realistic way of changing society. We have many alternative ways put to us of confronting that power, of trying to undermine it, of trying to do something else with it. But the only realistic method of changing it is first of all to see that that power is sustained by the willingness of the majority of people. And that willingness has therefore got to change to a rejection of it. And that can only be achieved through consciousness. And second, having seen that consciousness grow in the majority of people, having found that the majority of people now say no to the capitalist system, we don't want it anymore, we want to get rid of it and establish socialism, how is it to be done? And there is only one realistic and valid way, and that is for them to go to the point where the whole entity of capitalism is sustained and backed and fortified, and that is to the state. Once you take hold of that, then the capitalist class, whether it be large or small, has no more power. This is where its power resides. If you look at this in a simple, everyday kind of way, there used to be, years ago, I haven't heard it for a long time now, a sort of direct actionist, anarchist byword. What we will do is lock the bosses out of the factories. A most redundant phrase, because the bosses are never in the factories. They are sensible people. They keep as far away from them as they possibly can. But the bosses, nevertheless, are still their factories. What magic works here? How do they manage to obtain that they are still their factories? Through the state. Because the state sustains, affirms, and protects that ownership. And it is only through the state that you can take it away.